Technical difficulties.
No
Michael,
worries.
I'm gonna make you the host of this event, and then that
Okay.
means
Sure.
I can leave for a second to help with some stuff.
For sure, no problem.
And you'll have to let people in. I'm sorry. I'll be back.
Okay.
Hi, you guys.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm Mike. How do I pronounce your name?
Oh, let me let me change it. You would just say Castañeda. I'm actually in the process of changing my last name.
Okay.
Anyway, so
It's Michael Schulze, right?
no, you could just go with Castañeda. Let me.
Oh Lord, Castaneda.
Yeah. Should I start letting people in?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Cindy. You're muted. Hi, Cindy.
Oh, I really enjoyed Bill Fletcher's opening speech today. It was very good.
It was amazing.
Yeah, it was great. He always gives such a thought-provoking presentation.
Yes, definitely. I was in another one that was really good with about Dr. James Lawson.
Oh, no. Yeah, I wanted to see that. Yeah. Jamie Partridge. Hello.
Hey, Cindy Domingo. How are you?
Great to see you.
And great to be seen in a long time.
I know. I'll have to come and visit you one day down there. It's been too many years.
Yeah, we're still here in Portland, Oregon.
Yes. Doing good work, I hear.
Yeah.
So we're gonna give it another minute before we get started. Let's see, I need to change my view because I can't, well, I got it in gallery. Oh, okay, so we have 12 participants, 10, 12. We'll give it to 120. So how's everybody? Are you loving the heat?
Oh, it's too hot. Hi, Cassie.
Hey, Andrew. It's good to see everybody.
Everything seems to be going okay now.
Oh,
Okay,
good for
cool.
you. Fixed everything, huh?
I hope so. We had this thing where one session would start and it would cancel, make another session cancel.
Oh.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, that's what happened to me just a minute ago.
But I think we're doing okay now. All the sessions are going.
Great.
Yeah, sorry everybody.
No big deal. We're just happy to be here. Okay, so it's 1:20. Do you guys want to get started or you want to give it a few more minutes?
Oh, let's go ahead.
Okay, all right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so happy to have our guest speakers here today for Red, Green, and International. Our three speakers are Michael Castañeda, Cindy Domingo, and Edgar Franks. So we're going to start out by, I'm so glad that Michael told me his name was Castañeda, and I just learned that word last week. I got stuck in Oklahoma and I went to this Ted Castañeda's Mexican restaurant and the food was amazing. So it's not my first time hearing that name, but it would have been messed up otherwise. So Michael Castañeda is an assistant professor of comparative ethnic studies in Fairhaven College at Western Washington University. Michael received his PhD in comparative ethnic studies from the University of California, Berkeley. His research uses social movement history to explore how communities of color both question and cross racial boundaries. His current research project, No Separate Peace, Multiracial Struggles Against Racial Capitalism in the Pacific Northwest, explores this process by examining the parallel and overlapping activism of Black construction workers in Seattle and Filipino cannery workers in Alaska between the 1970s and early 2000s, of which he will be talking about today. Cindy Domingo is the board chair, a legacy of equality, leadership, and organizing, better known as the acronym LELO, and Akaban North America, a socialist party in the Philippines. Cindy is a writer, organizer, educator, and has been an activist for almost 50 years, using her skills to create social change at home and abroad by building solidarity between working people everywhere. She co-edited the book, A Time to Rise, Collective Memoirs of the Union of Democratic Filipinos, the only radical organization in the US Filipino community during the 1970s through the 80s. She is a contributor to the book, Women Against Marcos, Stories of Filipino and Filipino American Women Who Fought a Dictator. Edgar Franks is a political and campaign director of Familias Unidas por la Justicia, an independent farm workers union that began in Bellingham, Washington, as it made history in 2016 when they organized the Union of Indigenous Families. Thank you to Edgar for coming today to replace Rosalinda Guilllén, who could not make it at the last minute. We know that you're terribly busy on the berry farm as berry season just opened. So thank you for making the sacrifice to come, Edgar. But you can tell us more about that work and the work that you've been doing with agricultural workers during the pandemic. These three speakers will give us a historical and current perspective of essential workers who produce our food in the fields, canneries, and fisheries, as well as look at the historical struggle to build solidarity with each other. While essential workers is a term coined during the pandemic, we have always had essential workers throughout our societies, and the struggles they've undertaken under difficult conditions like the COVID-19 pandemic are significant to working class history. I mean, you know, we kind of take it for granted when we're eating all the sacrifices that were made to do it. I myself actually worked in the fields in Florida picking cucumbers and tomatoes. So I have some idea of what it's like to be out there in the sun, running away from snakes and everything else. So you guys go ahead, take it over.
All right, so I'll just kick it off. Let me see if I could share.
Thank you.
I'll just jump into it. So one, I'd just like to say I'm honored to kind of share the space with Cindy, Edgar, and everyone that's joining us today. Today, you know, my presentation will focus on some of the historical lessons, you know, we could draw from previous generations of labor and community organizers. You know, as someone who studies the multiracial labor history of the Pacific Northwest, you know, I draw inspiration from just kind of the new forms of collective organizing that are being produced daily. But personally, you know, I've been thinking a lot in terms of when I'm kind of working on my research, thinking about kind of the stories of solidarity that we need to elevate in kind of this moment. And something I've been thinking a lot about is, you know, solidarity isn't just the way different individuals and organizations show up for one another, but it's also about the ways in which the political relationships that cross racial boundaries and national lines serve as forms of political education, right? And what I found in my research is that by being in struggle together, whether this involves working together on a campaign, creating new organizations or coalitions, or forming study groups, these provide political spaces for community and labor organizers to grow our analysis together and apply that expanded political framework to our local circumstances, right? So in the time that I have remaining, I want to share one example of this from my research. You know, I'll focus on a 1975 campaign that was led by a group of Black construction workers, the United Construction Workers Association, or the UCWA. The UCWA has a long history of challenging anti-Black racism in Seattle's building trade starting in the 1970s. However, 1975 was a critical turning point within their organization, where they began to openly articulate an anti-capitalist critique of unemployment, and one that was positioned in solidarity with national liberation struggles in the third world, right? So I plan to discuss how the UCWA's political relationships with other radicals of color in the Pacific Northwest, particularly Filipino labor activists, shaped this radical turn in their labor organizing. So first, I'd just like to offer a little background on the UCWA. The UCWA was formed in the summer of 1970, immediately following a precedent-setting US Department of Justice lawsuit against Seattle's construction industry, US versus Iron Workers Local 86. So the courts found 4 of the 5 major building trade unions in Seattle responsible for dispatching workers to different construction sites, guilty of blatant practices of anti-Black racism. Their union membership rolls were telling of this racist practice. The unions under investigation had a collective membership of 15,000 workers, and less than 10 of those were Black in 1970, right? So the UCWA quickly formed to mobilize Black workers who entered the construction industry via this court-ordered affirmative action plan. From the beginning of UCWA's organizing efforts, they had a clear understanding of a racist political economy that produced alarming levels of Black unemployment in Seattle. So in January of 1971, they conducted a door-to-door survey of unemployment in Seattle, predominantly Black neighborhood of the Central District, when the UCWA factored those who gave up on seeking employment. Individuals typically not accounted in unemployment statistics. Seattle's Central District boasted a staggering 48% unemployment rate. So for UCW activists, desegregating the construction industry was a matter of how Black workers could survive a political economy that rendered them surplus and disposable sectors of the working class, right? So for those in the UCWA, initially they viewed Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act as an organizing tool for Black working class survival. However, by 1975, UCWA activists openly questioned whether civil rights law could be a tool of radical social change. So in 1975, the number of Black workers in the building trades and Seattle's construction industry numbered close to 500, largely as a result of the UCWA's political efforts. Despite these significant inroads, the prospects of survival in an unforgiving capitalist economy seemed just as dire. When the UCWA surveyed Black unemployment in the mid-1970s, it still hovered above 40%. Moreover, unemployment, particularly in Seattle's construction industry, cut across racial lines and was still for the industry workforce upwards of 20%, right? So when UCWA took to the streets in 1974, shutting down construction sites, they still called for desegregation, but they proposed a new long-term goal, what they called meaningful jobs for all. It was basically a plan of creating full employment in Washington state. So in a pamphlet of Seattle's 1975 May Day celebration, they explained what meaningful jobs for all would look like, or at least explained in the context of clear anti-capitalist terms. They said, "We are human beings with human needs. Given half a chance, people will work to satisfy these needs. But right now, we don't work for ourselves. Our work goes to satisfy the inhuman cravings of a tiny class of rich people. We're demanding meaningful work for all. We understand that we will not have meaningful work until working people of this country gain control and run in our own interests. We must start somewhere. We know who's got the money. Let's figure out ways of using it." So when you see the UCWA activists were referring to who's got the money, this was in direct reference to corporations in Washington state, whose profits collectively were estimated $2.5 billion in 1974, right? By the UCW's estimations, 40% of those profits would give work to 100,000 people at $10,000 each per year. They further called for shortening the workday from 6 hours to 8 hours, but allowing people to get the same pay. And but just kind of brings us back to the discussion of kind of the question of how this political shift and political thinking was shaped by their alliances with other communities of colors. I want to discuss the ways Filipino labor radicals influence this new political approach. If I had a PowerPoint, I would show kind of these demonstrations in the 1975 that were actually led. The folks in the front leading the march were UCWA's Filipino allies, Domingo Jr. and his younger brother, Selmy. They had a long history of working in solidarity with the UCWA. And as a result of the UCWA's relation with them and other Filipino cannery workers, they were exposed to radicals who had a concrete relationship with social movements in the third world. So a central political question that animated Filipino radicals since they migrated in significant numbers to the US in the early 20th century was their political responsibility back home in the Philippines with where their folks are subjected to US colonialism, later US neocolonialism. In 1974, UCW's allies and Filipino community, Michio and Silmi Domingo, stepped into this radical tradition. That year, they co-founded the Seattle chapter of the Katipunan ng mga Demokratikong Pilipinas, which in English translated to the Union of Democratic Filipinos, or KDP for short. At the time, the Philippines was subjected to a US-funded martial law regime of Ferdinand Marcos. And if you look at like KDP flyers of the time, they often use the term "down with the US Marcos dictatorship," right? So this was in direct reference to kind of the interconnections between the US and the Philippines. So the KDP had a domestic agenda in the US that involved supporting kind of civil rights struggles and building kind of a socialist alternative in the US, but also a critical dimension of their activism involved supporting struggles for national democracy in the Philippines, which was led by the Communist Party of the Philippines. So national democratic struggles sought to bring an end to martial law through creating a series of above ground organizations that mobilized different sectors of Philippine society, such as students, teachers, and indigenous groups. But they also supported the New People's Army, a guerrilla force that waged armed struggle against the US-funded Marcos dictatorship. And just to kind of talk about how kind of this iteration of Filipino like radicalism influenced the UCWA, from my research, I found personal invitations to the second KDP National Congress that were addressed directly to UCW organizers, Michael Wu and Tyree Scott. I think it was important for two reasons. First, the National Congress offered a summation of the KDP's domestic and international work. Secondly, as an ideological institute, accompanied the conference, where KDP members study Marxist theory and applied it to their different areas of work, right? So through this, UCW activists were introduced to a particular model of transnational solidarity that KDP activists modeled, right? On one level, the KDP provided concrete support, such as fundraising on behalf of political prisoners. Secondly, the KDP utilized Filipino Americans' position within the US working class to push American institutions such as labor unions to support liberation struggles of Filipinos under the martial law regime, right? And just to kind of close, I think the clearest example of the influence that Filipino radicals had on the UCWA found in the UCWA's new demands in 1975 for meaningful jobs for all. If I had more time, I include kind of a larger quote from UCWA leader Tyree Scott, where he's explaining the meaning of meaningful jobs for all. But he frames the struggle for meaningful jobs for all as an act of solidarity with several brothers and sisters around the world, right? Who he said were struggling victoriously against foreign imperialism. For Scott, civil solidarity didn't emphasize sameness, but focus on differences. So what I mean by that is those in the UCWA didn't equate their struggles in the US as with being a worker in the Philippines during martial law. Rather, they looked at what Filipino workers, as well as workers in Africa and Latin America, were enduring: the suspension of rights to unionize, mass arrests, torture, political assassinations. But despite that, they still resisted state violence, right? So in this political context, UCWA activists asked themselves, what's the role of the US worker to the international working class, right? And they concluded they needed to attack capitalism and US empire from within. The creation of meaningful jobs for all was a step in that direction. And I think the multiracial genesis of this critique through kind of dialogues with folks in the KDP, but also Chilean folks that were in exile in the US, indigenous folks fighting for like fishing rights in Washington State, these all kind of inform kind of their politics, right? So I think it offers kind of a definition of solidarity. Like I said, it's not simply just showing up times of crisis, but involves kind of folks taking large intellectual leaps together as they try to build a better world. And I think this is a model of solidarity worth thinking about. So I'll just end it there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Edgar. I'm with Familias Unidas por la Justicia. Yeah, I'm taking the place of a great person, Rosalinda Guilllén. She's our mentor here. One of the big reasons that we were able to win a union contract here at Sakuma Brothers Farms in Burlington. So Familias Unidas is an independent farm worker union based in Burlington, Washington. And the membership, it's quite unique. It's almost all Mixteco or Tiki indigenous people from Guerrero and Oaxaca, Mexico. I serve as their political director for the union. And it is berry season. And right now, as we speak, everybody's out picking in the fields in this hot weather. So, we're trying to look after their safety right now. There are no days off. And, obviously, throughout the pandemic, workers have been thrown into the front lines of keeping the production moving and the profits coming into the agricultural industry that has always been really unfair in the treatment of farm workers. But, for 4 years of boycotting and going out on strikes and organizing a boycott of Driscoll's, Familias Unidas was able to win this historic contract here in Burlington and became recognized officially in 2016 as the newest farm worker union in the United States. So we're really happy. I mean, and it happened right here in the backyard where I grew up. I grew up here in Skagit County. So, and I think that, Familias Unidas is in this position, I think, right now, and given the current political moment, to really offer some lessons and from that we've learned throughout the years, even though it's been fairly, we're fairly new, started organizing in July of 2013 till now. But the role of internationalism has been very, critical to the analysis and why we need more unions in general in agriculture. A lot of the workers, all of them are immigrants, so they've been exploited not only in their home country, but when they get here into the United States. But throughout that migratory circuit that, all the way from the South Mexico to here and almost near the Canadian border, there's traces of solidarity and a path of those connections that still exist. Many of the workers have formed independent organizations, not necessarily unions, but worker organizations and community organizations that specifically address the needs of indigenous peoples that are migrating. So whether you're in Oaxaca, Sinaloa, Baja California, Oregon, and now in Washington, there's these connections that are made, and a lot of the workers that are here in Washington, as a matter of fact, have families and connections still in their home country and here. So those bonds are really strong and, crucial to really try to address the needs here in Washington, but also how we can be in solidarity and also be in support of the struggles that are going down south from here to make sure their communities are okay. So, we've been really trying to be intentional about the way that we build and organize on that front. Because we also know that, the agricultural model that exists in the United States, this agricultural, basically almost like a production line, but out in the open, out in the fields, exists not only here in Washington, but all over where there's industrial agriculture. So, for us to be involved in a fight that, we have the opportunity to show that we can win against these multinational corporations and this historically, racist institutions of industrial agriculture and agricultural in general. We've been able to, kind of carve a new path for farm workers, and I think an example of that within the last couple of years that we've been engaging in, well, obviously in direct actions, which is, where really the power comes from. So participating in strikes that happened last year in Yakima with warehouse workers, apple packing warehouse workers, that all Mexicans and Latino workers, undocumented and immigrants. So we were able to go and support and offer, some of the lessons that we learned here about why we need to organize. And we're still organizing in Eastern Washington with the warehouse workers and other workers there, especially H-2A workers also that are coming in, the guest workers, people under the H-2A visa, which were some of the hardest hit workers under the COVID pandemic. So, and then, we still, whenever there's work stoppages, people still reach out to us and want our support on when they're out doing those direct actions. And, as a matter of fact, we got a call from Quincy yesterday from another set of workers that wants to organize. So, this is going to be, I think, a long summer, but a really exciting one for organizing agricultural workers, which is, what I think the union Familias Unidas was set up to do, to kind of start a ripple effect of workers organizing. But in our community, sometimes people need to see it to believe it. So, we kind of gave an example, and other people are kind of trying to, also model some of their organizing behind that. And we want to support workers that, want to organize independently and form their own worker organizations. So yeah, current, another example that we're fairly new and getting involved in is to like the world of policy and that kind of arena. So we passed we're able to win a Supreme Court case a couple of years ago that for the first time in Washington State, workers were able to get paid rest breaks, which is a right that was denied for since the existence of agriculture in Washington. And workers were able to have that right and also get retroactive pay for the 3 years prior to when the law was passed or when this court decision was made. And then this year we were able to pass overtime through legislature in Washington, which will go into effect in January, and really have the full effect will take place in 3 years, but for next year we'll be able to finally start getting overtime back. We're still fighting on the retroactive front, but the growers are still, they're mounting their campaign to undo a lot of the wins that have been made by farm workers. So, I think it's a constant struggle of fighting, and something that we always have to be on our toes and look out for, because we do get these wins and we get to celebrate a little bit, but we know the growers and the farmers are already organizing against what those wins that we're getting. Case in point, the Supreme Court decision that came down last week, which took away the access right to union organizers in California, well, now throughout the nation. So, that was born out of the struggle of United Farm Workers for like years and decades to get that passed. And then within a couple weeks, that 30-year struggle was just undone, just like that. But it gives us an opportunity again to not, to fight why we need to keep fighting for more and always daily need to be fighting for more. So we want to still continue organizing workers that have not yet been organized, even though it's a struggle. We're still an independent union and small, I guess you can say, in terms of resources and staff, but the ones that are here are really determined to create social change while the time we're here. So try to push as much as we can and not just administer a contract, which would be easy to do. And we can really get into that mode of just administering, looking out for one contract, but we want to also go and outreach and work with workers from everywhere to build more solidarity and be on the strike lines and picket lines and be more on the offensive about and see what's possible in organizing for farm workers as we are now in the 21st century. So we need a new farm worker movement for the new 21st century of organizing with, and I think to close, we talk about the policy and policy issues and a lot of the things that we're getting involved in, which is not where we want to be, but it's kind of necessary for the union now to get involved. It's like this thing called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which is a bill in Congress right now. But it's painted as a reform for farm workers to gain a pathway to citizenship. But in reality, it's a bill that was written by right-wing farmers in Congress. One of them from Washington State, his name is Dan Newhouse, which seeks to expand the H-2A program, which is problematic, and also make E-Verify mandatory for all of agriculture, and which we see as an attack on workers. If that bill had passed a couple of years ago, our union would probably not even be here. We'd be displaced by H-2A workers. So, I think building the power here locally is really crucial, but also building that network across the United States and internationally to provide an analysis of what's really going on, because as we see it, these guest worker programs are taking hold all over the world, and it's just a way to bust unions and workers organizing. We see Philippines, I think, has a big program like this. Canada uses it. Mexico starting to use it. So, it's something that we really need to get prepared for and fight against and really offer alternatives. And that alternative is, it always comes down to organizing farm workers. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think my time is up.
Thanks, Edgar and Michael. What's obvious from both of those examples, both historically and currently, is that agricultural workers, cannery workers, construction workers based here in Seattle and then went to the South were all very bold in their vision. It often surprised us what we were able to accomplish. But we always knew that the struggle would continue. As Edgar was talking about the recent Supreme Court decision, that was one of the victories that LILO was able to gain when they were organized. UFW was organizing farm workers here in Washington State, and Michael Fox, who was the lawyer in LILO, helped win that as he worked with the United Farm Workers out of LILO. We make gains, but we also have setbacks. And what was also very obvious was that it took a very broad popular front to win those victories. It was never just Black construction workers, and that was the reason for the formation of LILO, was that we knew that all workers of color, including white women, poor whites, were also struggling for jobs in the construction industry. And white women were also fighting discrimination in the canneries. At a certain point, agricultural workers were united in terms of Mexicans and Filipinos as being used as exploited workers during the turn of the century and into the 40s and 50s. Many things also have changed during from the periods of the 30s and 40s in terms of the canneries and in the fields. there is always the international link, but for most Filipinos who worked in the agricultural and the canneries, they were documented. They didn't have full citizenship, but they were documented. They were allowed to come under certain immigration laws that were open in order to recruit and retain that labor force for the canneries and the agriculture. But today in the canneries, the majority of the workforce is no longer just Filipinos or white women, but it is multiracial. It comes from all over the world. And as Edgar was saying, they do come under H-2A workers visas. They come from Mexico, they come from the Philippines, they come from Southern California, as documented people, but they also come from Eastern Europe. So it is a multiracial workforce, and it is assembled in a very short time. While many people come, every season, many people come for one season because it's quick money. And so it is assembled in a very short time and comes from all over the world. And 3/4 of the people that work in the fish processing industry in Alaska are non-residents. So Alaska's workforce scales up from 3,000 people in the wintertime to 20,000 jobs in the summertime because of fish processing. And if you know anything about the fish processing in Alaska, it's like organizing in the wild, wild west, because people are no longer just working on in canneries that are on land, but they're working on floating processors, like huge boats that have been converted into fish processing plants. And so it's very difficult to organize workers on those fish processors. And in fact, the Alaska Cannery Workers Union, who only had one organized cannery, in which in the decades before had many organized canneries, was down to one cannery and 500 union members. They recently lost that cannery as it was sold to another international corporation, and they are fighting to keep their contract. But that is a continuing struggle to keep that one unionized cannery. And because of the nature of the majority of the fish processing on these boats, which are that people can't just enter in, or it's very difficult to be undercover as they used to do in terms of organizing canneries. The spread of COVID, in spite of the precautions that Alaska wanted to take in terms of the fish processing industry, the pandemic spread very quickly in some places. Alaska was careful to set certain protocols into place, having quarantine periods, guidelines, but in many places, the guidelines were difficult to come by, and training for both the workers as well as the companies often didn't take place in the way it should be. And last summer, as early as May 6th of last summer, cannery workers began to test positive in some of the canneries. And by about a year ago, when the pandemic was beginning to come into its height, 150 cannery workers that were bound for Naknek were forced into quarantine en route to the Naknek cannery. They were stopped in LA after 3 people were tested positive, and then they were herded into unsafe conditions in hotels, and 150 cannery workers ended up being quarantined. This was just one example of how the pandemic started to spread, and it began, and so it's really untold in terms of unknown how many cases of the pandemic actually occurred in the fish processing industry at last summer, and how many individuals were affected and then were allowed to then go home to their homelands to spread it further. I think what was also important to learn about the period of the pandemic was that people also began to understand for the first time, because the pandemic was global, people began here in the United States to face shortages. They began to think about international supply chains. Most people in the United States never think about international supply chains because all they do is go into the grocery store or to the farmer's market, and there is everything they need. They never think about they don't have enough toilet paper, or there's no more lettuce on the shelves, or even the price of lumber, which escalated to 700% of what it used to be before the pandemic. All of these ordinary people began to think about not only essential workers, but also the concept of the international supply chains and the origination of products. And that was true, for seafood, true of all of the canning industry goods, as people face shortages here in the United States. And they also began to think of or open to what is happening to workers abroad. If you look at the Philippines, conditions in the Philippines were very difficult because of the authoritarian government of their Philippine president, Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte initially denied that about the conditions of the pandemic, would not take precautions or issue guidelines in terms of isolation, guidelines around how people should deal with the pandemic, and did not order shutdown, especially of the larger cities like Manila. Cebu, the second largest city in the nation, had a very progressive mayor that actually took precautions. However, Duterte failed to do that, and COVID spread like wildfire. So then at a certain point, Duterte then took the position of anybody who did not isolate, we're going to put in prison or in jail. So people who lived on the street because of poverty were arrested, put in jail, and then the further spread of COVID. For many of the people who worked in the rural areas, like fisher folk and agricultural workers, there was no concern about what that would mean for their economic status should rural areas, towns, as well as in Manila, do a complete shutdown. So there was, because in the rural areas around agriculture, once the shutdown was put into place, there was no ability for agricultural workers to leave their homes in order to take care of their farms. And there has been, and then transport workers were not allowed, if there was any produce being produced or fisher folks able to go fishing, the supply chain for the food was stopped. And they had a very serious food shortage in Manila, which is a city of over 20 million people. So the authoritarian regime of Duterte has essentially caused a collapse in the economy. There's no concern for the poor people in the rural areas, much less the poor people in the cities. Rich people were able to just have food delivered, but poor people are not able to earn money, much less have food delivered to them. And many of them are living on the streets anyway. So, you know, one of the things that occurred in Manila, which has happened here in the United States under the pandemic, was the whole concept of mutual aid. So as the cities began to open up in Manila, many of the organizations, progressive organizations, began um, uh, programs around mutual aid. They had food pantries that the homeless people could and poor people could come and get food, fresh produce, any kinds of fish that was still being brought into the city. And there was a bigger amount of community support and mutual aid. We saw that here in the United States in the development of various mutual aid programs. You know, at a certain point, our government, because of packages that were passed in Congress, money was passed, but people didn't know how to access that money, much less how to then distribute food, masks, antiseptics, etc. And community groups, who both were nonprofits, but as well just mutual aid groups, stepped up to ensure that the needs of the communities, especially the communities of color and poor communities, that their needs were met. And so the whole concept of mutual aid is something that you'll see both on an international scale in countries as well as in local areas like in the Seattle area, as well as other cities I've read. So, you know, I wanted to kind of leave some time. We're at 2:03 and we're supposed to end in about 10 or 12 minutes. So I wanted to leave some time for discussion and, you know, and then I also just wanted to thank Edgar again for stepping in for Rosalinda at this point in time. You know, Rosalinda is actually very much like Tyree Scott. I said Tyree Scott was a working class genius, and I think Rosalinda is also a working class genius. And geniuses often develop other people just like them. And so Edgar is one of those great organizers and a great mind himself. So with that, I'd like to open it up. If people have any questions or further discussion or points you'd like to add in.
Hi everyone. I'm Maria Quintana. I just wanted to ask a question. I put it in the chat field. I wasn't sure if I should just speak it, but I wanted to thank you for talking about your important work. And one of the questions I had for you today was, could you speak to the challenges and successes you've had with organizing H-2A workers? How have you organized in solidarity with them? And how have you been able to do that given the deportation regime?
Well, in Washington, there's over 30,000 H-2A workers now. When I first started I was at community working under Rosalinda. There was like around 5,000 in 2012. So the program has grown exponentially, but we know that it's always been very exploitative and bad. It wasn't until 2017 that we had our first kind of run-in or experience working directly with H-2A workers in solidarity when one of the work farms in Sumas, Washington, right next to the Canadian border, went out on strike because one of their coworkers got sick and wasn't taken to the hospital, and eventually passed away, and like 100 workers walked off the job, all under the threat of being deported themselves and blacklisted. They reached out to Familias Unidas and C2C at that time to support them. And because there was a huge, media attention, not only from our local, but also international, because it became national news in Mexico about the treatment of Mexican H-2A workers, that it got a lot of exposure. So from just social media and just a whole bunch of other things, just like even workers from are from the same towns that are working around Washington and other places, just passing information along. We got contacted by a lot of H2A workers from all over the country and from Washington. So we were able to offer support in whatever they needed. A lot of wage theft, blacklisting, threats of deportation, and human trafficking cases were made. A lot of civil suits were made also. So it's been really, but it's really hard to do outreach because of how much control the growers have over the lives of the H2A workers. I mean, even visiting them at their house, it's almost impossible. So it's difficult, but we've been able to kind of, you know, through social media, I think has been the most effective way. You know, now with this access law, we don't know what that means, but we're still going to try to push the boundaries of what that means or what we can and can't do. But we never depended on a law much per se anyways to do outreach to farm workers. But, you know, I know it's it rolls back a lot of the gains and sets a bad tone for farm worker organizing. We were able to pass through legislature here in Washington. It's kind of like an oversight for the H2A program. It's the only one in existence, as we know, in the United States. There are representatives from the industry and advocates and from labor. And that's where we kind of meet to discuss what's really happening under H2A program. So at least that offers some oversight, but it's, I mean, it's not enough. But I mean, it's a starting point, but organizing with H2A workers, it's very difficult, especially because they're always afraid to come out publicly and stage actions, you know, but that's the risk they take. I think to get things fixed, they have to go public, but to go public is exposing yourself and possibly getting blacklisted.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that. Did you mention, was it Alifa or Aliva? What was the organization? You said there were some advocates that have been able to reach them as sort of overhead.
Well, I know the ones that, I mean, for reaching with C2C and yeah, community development. That's Rosalinda's organization.
Oh yeah.
And our union, yeah. But
wonderful.
Yeah.
Great work. Thank you so much. It's great to hear that you're doing that, even if it's hard and challenging at times. And Michael, I wanted to say hi really quick. Thanks for sharing your work. It's been a long time. I'd love to catch up.
Lori Mercer has a question here. Can you mention some examples of successful building solidarity and outreach, such as locales, unions, and consumers to assist worker organizing?
And I could just jump in real quick, just as a historical example. In terms of the type of organizing that you know, the UCWA did, they essentially used Title VII to kind of organize workers of color that have historically kind of been left behind by the labor movement. You know, and it became, you know, was never seen as like an alternative to having a labor union, but it was like a way of you know, building kind of bases of power for that kind of community centered for working class communities of color. And I just think one like really powerful example is, you know, for cannery workers, you know, they had like a long history of like militant labor organizing dating back to the 30s. But, you know, McCarthyism really allowed a very conservative brand of union leadership to kind of step in, right? And it was a Filipino-led union, so really kind of conservative sectors of their own community were critical to kind of exploiting or taking part in the exploitation of the most, so the, I think the acronym United Construction Workers Association is a Black Construction Workers Association. And then the Cannery Union was a International Longshoremen and Warehousemen Union, Local 37. And to kind of make a long story short, I think one of the really important examples is, this Black worker organization actually put up the money to, they use their own money that they won from legal cases against racism in the building trades to pay for Filipino workers to kind of do investigations in the canneries, pay for them to outreach to workers who are working across like the migrant cycle in California, and like gave them, I think another really important thing is they shared with them their organizing strategy, right? So really kind of making all these forms of resources that they had, from financial to access to lawyers to actual kind of political strategies collected, and I think that's a really important kind of story in terms of, we have resources that exist in our community, and we could, they really made, they didn't rely on like a bigger kind of structure to kind of do that. They created these networks themselves.
Edgar, do you want to speak to that?
Which one?
Well, either one, what Michael spoke to, or there's another question for Jamie. What are the differences for farm worker organizers in BC, Washington, Oregon, and California for H2A organizing? How do you support each other?
Okay. Well, actually, we do have a relationship with an organization in British Columbia, in the Okanagan region. It's called Radical Action for Migrants in Agriculture. They're like almost like a mutual aid organization, specifically for seasonal agricultural workers. And they also have great analysis on the program in migration and immigrant rights in Canada. So we try to work with them, build that solidarity across the border. As far as other organizations that we've talked about, specifically on the issues of H2A and are aligned, is Farm Worker Association of Florida and CATA, Centro de Apoyo para Trabajadores Agrícolas in New Jersey, and La Alianza Agrícola in upstate New York in the Rochester area. So those are kind of our organizations that we're kind of aligning ourselves about, about what the H2A program, why it's bad, and why we can't have it, or restructure it or something, but preferably not have it. I know there's a sponsor, a nonprofit labor recruiting nonprofit arm that was founded by the U of W. It's called Cierto. So it's kind of like labor recruiting. So I don't know what their stance is on organizing H2A workers. It's my understanding that the workers that are brought in under this program aren't under union contracts. They're just, being brought in labor, hired like labor, basically a labor contracting organization, nonprofit. But yeah, for us, we took the stance already that it's exploitative. So there is no really, we can't be on that side if we already called it exploitative. We prefer open borders and giving amnesty to everybody.
Yeah, that'd be great. Right. Capital has no borders. Why should workers?
Yeah.
I just want to speak to, I guess we have to close, right, Andrew? But I just want to speak about one example, which we're just launching right now, and that is between the US labor movement and the labor movement in the Philippines. We are recently represented a representative in Congress, Susan Wild, just passed the, reintroduced the Philippine Human Rights Act, which would tie military aid to the human rights situation in the Philippines. While the President Duterte has gone off after all the progressive movements, you don't even have to be progressive to be put in jail or what they call red tagging, tagged as a communist to be targeted for murder, extrajudicial killings. The labor movement in particular has been red tagged, and in the last year, a number of key leaders have been murdered and of course assassinated in front of their families, in the streets, in their homes, and with no prosecution happening for the murders. They're carried out by the military or hired thugs. So we are, through the leadership of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance and hopefully SEIU's international offices, and we're hoping to pass a resolution at APALA's August National Convention, which would then tie aid again to the Philippines and trade to the Philippines, because trade, especially in this next period, is so important in terms of importing goods from the Philippines, to tie US trade to human rights situation in the Philippines. This was done before under a previous repressive, another repressive Philippine government, Gloria Macapagal, and we are hoping to use that tool to try to use the labor movement as well as congressional pressure to force the Duterte government to clean up its Human Rights Act there in the Philippines. And this is also in preparation for the 2022 presidential election in the Philippines, where the president's daughter is probably going to run to replace him. So that's just another example of how we can utilize, our congressional situation, laws, and international labor solidarity to try and change conditions in the Philippines or other places abroad. So with that, we're going to have to end. And I thank you all for coming, and great to see people I haven't seen for a little while, like Jamie. And thank you, Joe, for coming, and Andrew for helping us run smoothly. So thanks. And if you want to get a hold of Edgar or Michael, I'm sure if you contact Andrew or the Pacific Northwest Labor History Group, that they can give you their information. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you all for giving us such a great presentation and enlightening us. We appreciate it. Hi, James. Stay safe.
All right, we'll be moving on to the membership meeting now of the PNLHA. There's a link in the chat. I'm going to be closing this meeting and we'll be moving on to the next one. You can also find the link in your program. Thank you all for bearing with the technical difficulties, and thank you, Cindy and Michael and Edgar. This was a great session. So
Bye.
have a good day.
Bye. Thank you all.
Stay safe.